Welcome to the professor's discussion for Chapter 8, which is Performance Management and Appraisal. Chances are, if we've had a job, we've been through the performance appraisal process. Overwhelmingly, people rank performance review with the root canal, which is unfortunate because as humans, we crave feedback. Few of us would say and mean, "Don't tell me how I can do my job better." And if you've ever given a performance review, you know that role isn't much easier. So then it comes down to the process. What's wrong with what's currently being used that makes us so dissatisfied? These questions are worth considering with respect to why some managers and employees are dissatisfied in general. This chapter gives us an overview of the performance appraisal process and the different tools and methods available. Despite lots of attention, money, and effort, performance appraisals remain an area with which few managers or employees are satisfied. The goal here is for you to learn how to evaluate performance and give performance feedback regardless of what system is used. It can work and it can be a positive way to build employee engagement. Performance management is a system of setting goals, measuring performance, and cross-checking those results with the strategic goals that we set in our strategic plan. This system needs to be fair, effective, and widely understood by all. The goal of performance management is to support the strategic aims of the firm by establishing a valid and reliable process connecting the employees to it. As a manager, you will conduct performance appraisal activity, so it's important. Many employers still base pay and promotions on employee appraisals, so appraising performance is important for that reason. Next, appraisals play an important role in the employer's performance management process. Third, the appraisal lets the boss and the employee develop a plan for correcting any deficiencies and also reinforce the things that the employee does correctly. Fourth, appraisals are useful career planning tools we'll see in the next chapter. And finally, as we learned in the last chapter, appraisals play an important role in identifying training and development needs. Recall that this process is actually a part of the control function of management. We learned about that back in Management 1010. Effective appraisals begin before the actual appraisal process, with the manager defining the employee's job and performance criteria. Defining the job and the criteria means making sure that you and your employee agree on their job duties and the standards and the appraisal method that you should use. Performance appraisal is one activity that you see here, and it's this cycle that you see here on the slide. It involves setting work standards, assessing actual performance relative to those standards, and providing feedback to the employee. Now, in reality, this doesn't happen just every 6 months or once a year. The employee should receive continuous feedback throughout the entire time that they work. Employers frequently use, and employees have come to expect, their pay and promotions are determined by what's on their appraisals. Improvement in career development planning also originates with an effective appraisal system. And training and development activities are based on what's contained in the appraisal itself. Providing continuous feedback and making improvements to how employees and employers do things is all what contributes to the organization's success. Aligning these efforts and standards is a continuous process. When you see a performance problem, you take the time to take action immediately. And similarly, when somebody does something well, the best reinforcement comes right away, not 6 months later during the performance review. Now, step 1 in the process is setting the performance standards. Most employees understandably want to know what they'll be reviewed on in terms of performance. Much like students, they want to know how they're going to be graded. So let's see how we can make this happen. At the heart of performance management is the idea that an employee's effort should be goal-directed. Such a process involves clarifying these expectations and quantifying them by setting measurable standards for each objective. In other words, goals should be SMART. They should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And finally, employees should always have the opportunity to have meaningful input into the goals that they are going to try to achieve. Next is deciding who should assess the performance. Exactly who should do the appraising? Well, performance appraisal is a perfect example of an activity that's conducted jointly by the line manager and the HR department. The HR department is the policymaker. Those employees are the ones that structure this program that you as a manager will execute. So there's no question that the employee's immediate supervisor is usually in the best position to observe and evaluate an employee's performance. The manager is also typically responsible for that person's performance. HR is responsible for training managers on how to use the appraisal tools, making sure that the program is effective, and making sure that it's compliant with regulation. So having said that, who else might be involved besides the supervisor? Well, sometimes the employee's peers are involved. Peer appraisals are becoming more popular, particularly with firms that use self-managing teams. Self-ratings are also very important. Now, self-ratings can be higher than supervisor or peer ratings, but it's important to get input from the employee if we want buy-in in terms of how they're actually doing. Appraisals by subordinates is known as upward feedback. In this instance, subordinates anonymously rate their supervisor's performance. And we can complete this circle by using what's called 360-degree feedback. This is a pretty widely used system where ratings are collected from the employee's supervisors, subordinates, peers, and occasionally even internal or external customers. Let's keep things simple for a moment and assume that the employee's supervisor will be the person responsible for conducting the appraisal. Well, then we need to answer two questions. What are we going to rate, and how are we going to measure it? The what to rate question is really about the behavior and characteristics of the job, and that relates back to our job analysis and job description. We've set standards based on that job analysis and job description. These are the behaviors and characteristics that are necessary in order to successfully perform the job. How are we going to measure that? Your textbook goes through numerous methods, 4 of which we will focus on here in our discussion. First is what's called the graphic rating scale method. This is a very widely accepted method. It's simple and it's very popular. We'll use a scale to list a number of traits and then the range of performance for each of those traits. You can see that here on the slide. The employee is then rated by identifying the score that best describes their performance level for each trait. So there's a list of traits or aspects of performance such as timeliness, communication, or teamwork, and then there's a scale to rate the employee's level of performance based on that trait. And that scale ranges from some high level to some low level. So like I said, this is the first of 4 types of tools that we'll identify, and you can see an example of a graphic rating scale method in figure 8.4. Critical incident is another widely popular method. Here, a supervisor keeps a record of very good and very undesirable examples of an employee's work-related behavior, kind of like in a log or a journal. The supervisor then reviews the record with the employee at a predetermined time. This is actually an example of concurrent feedback, which is also a concept from Management 1010, because the idea is that if the incident is critical either to good or poor behavior, we're going to review it with the employee as soon as possible. Additionally, this critical incident method becomes the backup or the evidence by which we rate using the graphic rating scale method. The third method is what's called behaviorally anchored rating scales, or BARS. BARS is a method that combines the benefits of narratives, critical incidents, and quantified scales. So we do so by anchoring a scale with specific behavioral examples of either good or poor performance, like you can see here. The advantage of using the BARS method is it's accurate, it provides clear standards of performance, and it uses independent dimensions and forces us to be consistent. The last method is what we call management by objective. The manager sets specific measurable goals with each employee and then periodically discusses the progress towards those goals. In reality, of these 4 methods, a combination of them are typically used in any particular appraisal form. So be aware, you'll see a combination of these at your organization. Now, as stated earlier, a few things in our work are as stressful as the performance appraisal process and the interview. And as much as we like to make it an objective process, we're still talking about a human being's behavior, and by default, that makes us tend to feel judgmental. There are 6 types of potential problems that affect the appraisal process that you can see here. For instance, if the standards are unclear, ambiguous traits and degrees of performance can result in an unfair appraisal because we're just really not clear about what it is that we're evaluating. The halo effect is an example of influence. The influence of a rater's general impression on ratings of specific qualities is what the halo effect is. So good or bad, we tend to rank an employee's overall performance based on one specific trait. This is common, for example, when an employee may be a good worker in terms of production, but they fail to work well with others. If we're guilty of the halo effect, we're not going to knock them down on their work with others because they're good producers. Central tendency is an example of bias when we stick to the middle of the rating scale, which means everybody's average. Leniency or strictness occurs in a similar method if we have a tendency to rate everybody really high or really low. Recency involves letting what the employee did most recently blind the manager to the employee's overall performance for that period. And bias is a tendency to allow individuals with their differences such as age, race, and gender affect our employee appraisal ratings. In other words, rating somebody good, quote unquote, for being a woman. So with the problems and pitfalls, it might seem that no appraisal is better than a dysfunctional one. Well, that's not entirely true because we know humans crave feedback and they need the opportunity to correct their mistakes. So we need to utilize some best practices that can be found in your chapter. We have to understand the problems that we just identified exist. Know your biases and be aware of them because it helps you to minimize them. You want to select the right appraisal tool and make sure that you know how to use it. You also want to keep a diary or a file of artifacts and evidence that point towards the employee's level of performance. When you're meeting with the employee, you want to make sure that the plan that you have for the employee is also something that they've agreed on, and clearly you would need to be fair. Then the last point is being compliant. The courts have found that inadequate appraisal systems tend to be at the root of illegal discriminatory actions. In other words, our appraisal system isn't compliant, and if we're using that system as the basis for, let's say, training, pay, or promotion decisions, then we are going to be found of discriminatory behavior. To perform an effective appraisal interview, the supervisor and their employee review the appraisal document, and then they make plans to either remedy deficiencies or reinforce strengths. There are generally 4 types of interview themes, and they each have different objectives. The first theme is the employee's performance is satisfactory and they are promotable. This is perhaps the easiest interview to hold because the objective is to make development plans. That's a pretty exciting type of meeting. The next type of meeting is where the employee's performance is satisfactory, but they are not promotable. This type of interview has the objective of maintaining performance when promotion just isn't possible. The next type of interview theme could be where the employee's performance is unsatisfactory but correctable. This can be a difficult interview to hold, but with the objective to plan corrective action via the development and implementation of an action plan, it really doesn't have to be all that uncomfortable. The fourth type of meeting can be where the employee's performance is unsatisfactory and we don't find it to be correctable. Unfortunately, here we're likely talking about terminating employment, and that'll create a new set of guidelines and challenges we'll talk about in a later chapter. When we get ready for the appraisal interview, we want to review the job description and compare the employee's performance to the standards that we've set earlier in the process. We can prepare for the interview by making sure that we've assembled all of the relevant data, making sure that the employee has had an opportunity to provide their feedback, and making sure that we set up the proper time and place. During the appraisal interview, we want to be direct and specific using objective examples. We don't want to say that Bob is a bad employee. We want to say that Bob's behavior needs to be corrected. At the same time, we also need to encourage our employee to talk, because when they do, we can hopefully reach agreement on what the correction needs to be if that's something that's necessary. During perhaps a challenging appraisal interview, defensive behavior from our employee is very normal. And we don't want to ever attack or belittle a person's defenses because they feel legitimate to their behavior. So we want to make sure that we handle that defensive action. Sometimes in appraisal interview situations, they result in written warnings where the employee's performance just isn't up to par. Written warnings have to identify the standards by which we're making our evaluation, making it clear that the employee was aware of the standard. Then we want to make sure that we detail any type of violation and show that the employee will have an opportunity to correct the behavior. You also want to make sure that this written warning goes into his or her personnel file. Be realistic and honest when you give an appraisal. It's important that you be candid with your employee, especially if they're underperforming. While it's uncomfortable, you want to focus on the specifics to improve behavior and allow that time for improvement to happen. Now, despite all of the stress and uncomfortableness that comes with performance reviews, this is actually an enormous opportunity to build employee engagement. Think about it. If we can have a meeting where we can stress how the employee contributes to the big picture, how their work is meaningful, create a positive environment where they can talk, ask questions about what they need to do their job, talk about their strengths as well as weaknesses, and listen to them, we have set up a tremendous situation for positive employee engagement. Remember that appraisal is one part of overall performance management, which is the big picture. That's about developing people skills and performance so that they continually help us meet our goals and objectives. Remember that performance management is continuous, goal-directive, and modifying in the way people accomplish the work. The ultimate goal of performance management is to focus effort and resources by investing in our firm's future leaders.